Hi, I'm Steve James. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and it's my pleasure today to speak with Ondi Timoner, who has made this remarkable film, Last Flight Home. And so I get to talk to you about it today, ask you a bunch of questions. And first off is, at the beginning of the film, it's clear that you're recording, at least for audio purposes, some conversations with your dad when he's in the hospital. Um, did you kind of have the idea to do the film that early on, or were you kind of recording it for posterity, or what was your thinking there?
I was recording for posterity. I was recording because I was really panicked about forgetting his voice. That gravelly voice that was the center of my universe since I was born and had always been there for me. There was never a flight I took that where I didn't land, turn on my phone, and hear that voice on the other end because he was tracking my flight. So um, at the prospect of losing him from the land of the living, I just didn't even know. I mean, it was so shocking that he was in the hospital. And then when he was saying he needed to go and he needed to die, he was the most tenacious person any of us ever knew. So it was very surprising, even though, of course, everyone dies. We just had never wrapped our heads around dad leaving us. So I think I just started recording for that. If my family was in this Q&A, they'd say I record everything. So no one had any idea I was making a movie because they're so used to me filming, and I certainly, because I didn't have any idea the whole time actually that I was making a movie. I just knew that I needed to record him, and I even like went to seek mental advice from a counselor, from a therapist, about my urge to film and whether it was you know unhealthy for me or for everyone involved. And I was very surprised by her answer, actually,
Which was, can you share?
which was, if you feel you need to film, then you should. And I thought, wow, I thought she was going to tell me it was terribly inappropriate. And then I then called my father in the hospital and said, I feel like I need to film you when you come home to start this process of hospice. And he said, well, you know what, Andy, I think you're instinctively on the right track. And so I didn't know what track I was on per se, but he seemed to know something more than I did, and he was always very supportive of the process. And I think the whole family got more and more supportive the closer that the date came of his departure. It was like suddenly there was this was what would be left of him when he was gone. And I think it was comforting to people. But my sister, didn't like cameras, doesn't like cameras, so it had to be as seamless as possible. There was no crew or anything like that.
Yeah, that's kind of extraordinary. So all the while you're recording these last 2 weeks or whatever, I mean, and it sounds like because you have a history of doing this sort of thing, you have a habit of recording your family. Um, it's sort of like on some level they kind of maybe expected that you would do it. Although in this circumstance it would be fraught, obviously. But it wasn't an unusual thing for you to do. What the decision to make the film came after the filming was complete, or at some point during the filming?
After, Rachel came out about 5 days before, and I do have a Zoom recording of me asking her with my parents how she felt about having cameras there. And she was like, well, it wouldn't be my choice, but I defer to whatever mom and dad want. And they both advocated strongly for it. Um, but I did say in that Zoom that I felt that the End of Life Option Act, which was going to face a sunset clause in a couple of years, had become so vitally important to my father. And that, if anything, that we might use the footage one day to make a short film to help make sure that they didn't overturn it at that time. So I did have the inkling that maybe I could do it. Certainly not the personal film that I've created, but something with the hospice workers and all that I was recording there, because dad went from utterly despondent to having agency over his own body for the first time in 40 years. And it was a marked change in his spirits. And since actually putting this film out, I've talked to a lot of people who have had a family member go this way. And every single person says it allowed them to have such joy and peace at the end of their life, um, and the family to have closure. So I probably would have, Steve, ultimately made some kind of short film to help with the end of life subject, because I feel a debt to that whole process. I feel like it was a gift for us, and something that everyone should have the right to, and people don't. Most people don't in the world and in the country. So, but it was when my sister asked me to make a memorial video. She wanted me 2 weeks after Dad died to sit down and pick out like 5 minutes worth of clips of Dad. She's like, "Well, you have footage. Cut something together." So I wouldn't. I don't think I would have opened it that fast, honestly. Like, I don't think I would have been like, "All right, Dad's been gone for 2 weeks. Let's go ahead and delve through this painful journey that we went through." But it was so amazing when I opened the Avid to do this. I He was alive inside the Avid, and it was like he wasn't suffering anymore, so I could just be with him and not worry about him in pain or anything. But he was so funny, and he was so surprisingly, comforting to everybody. And of course, I was there, but we were all in somewhat of shock. And it was sort of the eyes of the camera that I was, through that lens, I was able to really spend an incredible like go on a journey that didn't stop for months after that. In fact, the memorial video turned into like a 32-minute video within a week. My sister was very upset because it turned into a film screening, and she had a memorial service planned. But then the people who were there was a Zoom reception, and people's like feelings about death had been changed from even just this memorial video, which certainly wasn't what you've seen in Last Flight Home. It was a lot lighter than that. But so that spurred me on, and I kind of went from like daughter, because I was like the primary caregiver during that time, to filmmaker, as I noticed, like, oh my gosh, every single person who comes in this room has an arc, you know? And there's this period of time, and I could edit this to make it where you kind of peel back the onion and you go from like this disembodied voice in the hospital to this powerless elderly man in a wheelchair being lowered into a bed in diapers, to what he says about Donald Trump, and then on from there, where he takes command, and he ends up really like his courage and sort of unwavering determination to do this affects everyone in who touches him, and his love, I think, really just like comes through.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I just felt like I had to share it at a certain point, and then my family was like, I mean, my sister especially was like, no. Obviously,
Well,
she changed her point of view.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's really a remarkable family document, but obviously it goes beyond that for others. I mean, I know I shared with you after I saw it that my dad died at home years ago after a long bout with Parkinson's, and he was bedridden for quite some time. And you know, I have nothing to really remember him by from that time. I made a film about him when I was in college about his business. I have that, but I don't have those later years, and then of course that end of lifetime. And so it really is a remarkable gift to have. And I think in a way it's a gift for you too, that when you were going through it, even though you were recording it, and it seems clear what you've done is you've set up cameras in different places around the room, right? So that you don't have to attend to all of the filming. You can actually do what you were there to do, which was to be the primary giver and daughter to him. So in a way, it's a gift to you that you weren't thinking that way at all. Because as a filmmaker, when you're wearing that hat, you're wearing that hat, and it can affect the experience you actually have. So you were able to kind of have that genuine daughter experience while recording it, and then put on that filmmaker hat.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One of the things I did, which I'm sure you'll appreciate, being a verite filmmaker yourself, is that I didn't. at first I had the main camera. I had the lav mics going into the main camera, which I put in an adjacent room, and there was a door, and the door had a perfect view of him and whoever was visiting him, but the camera was out of view for the most part. And so it actually became kind of a helpful way for everyone to connect, because anyone could. I found my son back there crying, watching his grandparents talk at the bed and listening, and they couldn't see him crying, and they had their own space, and I found my brother behind the camera watching his children with my dad.
Wow.
So that was an unexpected and really beautiful sort of side, benefit of having cameras. I put another camera behind the TV that nobody noticed. I put another camera on a hospital tray that was kind of just against the furniture. And I would just sometimes, Morgan, my partner who scored the movie, if she was around, I'd just be like, can you just make sure the red light's on? I'd just go back to being dad's daughter. But then if other people visited or I set up a Zoom call or something, then I was able to have something to do, that I could feel like I was contributing to the family archive, and to have like dad preserved in some way. I was like, I know I can bottle him up somehow, and I had always wanted to make a film about dad, like you made about your dad and his business. I always wanted to make a film about my dad's airline, and those years when I was 0 to 10, and he was, he had the fastest growing airline in the world because he led with such love and spirit, and then he had this stroke that was accidental, and he just, everything turned upside down. And so I've written a script about that, and those are the papers you see on this bed. That's how little I knew I was making a documentary. I was actually grateful that the cameras were there to record dad's impressions of the script, because I thought, you know what, I don't even want to take notes. I just want to be with him. But I do think that going through the script would be something that would be beautiful, because it will take him back through his life. And
Yeah.
and I was always going to make a scripted film because I never had any archival footage except for the 15 minutes you see in the film. Because unlike you, I was too young at that point to when he wasn't in at the height of his career. I was just a kid, so
Yeah.
I hadn't discovered cameras yet, so I don't have any footage from then. But the other thing I did, Steve, is I put a Nest camera up on the ceiling, because I didn't want to have to take any attention away from being with him to even like write on cards or keep track of anything. So I thought, well, I'll always have like a sense of time of day. And the other thing the therapist said was, you guys are all going to be in shock through the entire process. So, just keep that in mind. And it's really interesting because in the footage, I have found all kinds of things that I don't even remember happening. And I
Yeah.
was in the room, like when dad says Biden won and so did I. And my sister looks at me behind the camera and she goes, we did it. I didn't remember that scene, which is a really important scene and super important as personally, that he reached that epiphany, that he actually my whole goal was, I have these 15 days to convince dad that he gave us everything, that he was literally the greatest person we ever knew. And he felt like such a failure. So that was the mountain I was climbing the whole time. And that's the scene where he gives us the gift of telling us that. And I didn't even remember it. And I was cleaning up the film for Sundance, and I matched back to something and I found that scene, and that just shows you the state of mind that we're in when big things are happening in our lives. And we just, we can't possibly remember. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things that strikes me about your dad, and you sort of touched on this earlier, is his sense of humor, right? Of course, like he's got this incredible sense of humor, even as he's facing down death and very close to death. Was he always this funny? Was he always a guy with a tremendous sense of humor? And it's amazing, if so, you're nodding yes. It's amazing that did not abandon him. It did not seem to abandon him at all
No,
in this time.
no, he was so funny. He was the sharpest person any of us ever knew,
Yeah.
our whole lives. And it was kind of like, if you can imagine the pain and frustration of seeing your hero just ousted, and pushed out of everything because he's disabled. They even said, you know, the guy who was temporarily running the airline said to all the top employees, if you share anything with Eli when he comes back, I'm going to leave him. What do you think Lehman Brothers will think of a cripple running an airline? You know, and here he is, just so sharp, and then he has to watch the airline go down because the man didn't know how to run it, and still he would find a way to be humorous, and he would never complain. That was another thing that I felt like was really something that motivated me to want to share it. Was if you've ever read that book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, the idea, that how we suffer or suffering is one of the greatest opportunities we have to come in touch with our human spirit. And in that way, he suffered with grace, but he suffered with wit and humor.
Absolutely.
He made light of all of the heaviest situations, and that helped all of us. He was always helping all of us.
Yeah, it's like, in a lot. I mean, you guys are obviously taking care of him through this passage that he's going through, but he's taking care of you too.
He was taking care of us, I think, more than we were even taking care of him. I mean, that room was just, and I've heard from many people who lose loved ones that the space is a very sacred and beautiful space at the end. And I think it's because nothing else matters outside that space. And when I was asking Morgan to do this, on the score, I was saying, make it womb-like, like hold the audience in. There's a golden light in that room. And there's, they had their Buddha up on the table. I guess it's still up there. Mom still has it up there, but there's medical bottles and stuff, but the camera's always looking at this Buddha over Dad. And in so many ways, like, it was his room. And so even, if you take the end of life and that space that seems to occur for many people, and then you put Dad as the captain of that space, if you can imagine, it was just a beautiful place to be. I would wake up in the morning in my own bed, which is like 15 minutes from them. And I would jump on my bike or get in my car and go there as fast as I could. I never felt like I wanted to be away from there for any second that he was still with us. But the end of life and as Dad said, would you rather know when I'm going to die, or would you rather get a call in the middle of the night? And I'd had those calls, where he'd fallen on the floor and I'd gone over there and there were fire trucks outside and he had blood coming from his head. And I had to say, I'd rather know, and be able to plan for it and in a way produce the end of his life, with the Zoom calls and get the kids home so they could be with him. And, that was something that was super meaningful and that so many people, because we're scared of death, seem to avoid. They try to protect their children from a person who's dying, when there's, like, in a way, the life is at its absolute richest there at the end,
Yeah, that comes through loud and clear. Your sister, the rabbi, talks about how becoming a rabbi was directly influenced by him. You say at some point about how much influence he's had on you, but I don't recall. I mean, it's been a little while since I've seen the film. If you spell that out, what influence did your dad have on you in terms of becoming a filmmaker?
What a great question, Steve. Not surprising. Dad's influence on all of us was to love us unconditionally and believe in us unconditionally. So anything that I wanted to do, he just thought that was a great idea, And so when I said I wanted to be a documentary filmmaker, I was coming out of college or I was in college. I was a junior in college. And when I picked up a camera at 19 and I went into women's prisons, and I would drive out with the footage and I would think, this is like alchemy. I'm literally carrying these stories of these people who are trapped behind prison walls to now draw some kind of compassion bridge that it was just like blew my mind. And so when I was graduating from college, my parents were like, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to be a documentary filmmaker. And you were probably the only other documentary filmmaker at that time. Just kidding. But there really weren't too many of us. And all my friends at Yale were heading to like Morgan Stanley, and they were all like, what is a documentary filmmaker? And I certainly had no money and they had no money. And, it was a crazy, and then we're filming musicians for Dig, and my brother and I get arrested in Georgia. And my one phone call was to dad and mom, and they didn't scold me. They just tried to figure out how to get me out. But that was his contribution, was just like, you can do anything. Just like his flight attendant says in the film, he would always be like, you can do it. And then he would always just cheer me on. But I did end up filming a lot of sort of, I call them impossible visionaries, but like entrepreneurs or people who blaze their own trails. For almost all of my films are about people who are pushing the boundaries. And I think it's because, my dad was always the person I wanted to make a movie about, but I didn't know how to do it. Yeah. And so I would just chase these other stories. And I feel like, in a weird way, all those 30 years was preparation for this. Like, I don't think I would have been able to do this if I hadn't, filmed 2,500 hours of Dig. And, I think We Live in Public was like 5,000 hours or something, you know what I mean? And just all of that filmmaking prepared me to have filmmaking there for me at this like unbelievably terrifying moment in life. So.
Yeah. Maybe we'll finish up by talking about your mom a little bit. And I wonder, she's really interesting in the film for me as a viewer who has no history, obviously, with her and doesn't know her. And I think your brother even says it at one point in time, she does seem really torn by this thing that's going on, this decision, this sort of planning for dying. She's often in the film, she's on that side couch, and I'm wondering what's going through her head. And there are different points where she articulates some of that, which is great. But I wonder what this experience was like for her, of not just losing her husband of over 50 years, but also the way in which this was happening for her.
So, mom is mom went from jet setting for 17 years to caregiving for the next 30 some odd. They were married for 54 years, and it really broke her body. And even one time when dad was falling, she pulled him on top of her and they both went down to the ground. So there was a lot of mixed feelings there, because it was literally, she couldn't survive anymore if he was going to be home, because his body was just giving out, but his entrepreneurial spirit still had him wanting to try to walk. Even when he was in the hospice situation there at the end, at one point he asked David where his cane was, because he wanted to go to the bathroom. He hadn't walked in days. He wasn't going to walk again, and he was going to have to go to a facility. And that's why that's the first question in the film, because I think that's where he says, I'm out, because being with mom was everything to him. Doing the crossword puzzle, the New York Times crossword puzzle, politics. We always call it Pepper. Their house is on Pepper Drive. Pepper's the place for politics. They'd watch MSNBC together religiously, small r, religiously.
Yes.
And so she really was his pillar, but also his best friend. And she could not, and I think this is true for probably a lot of people, wrap her head around life without him. And she says that right now is the hardest. It's really setting in that he's just gone, and she can't have him there, and she's lonely without him. And the film is something that is sort of a miracle, in that, for even the memorial video first and then rough cuts of the film, she'd watch anything as soon as there was footage to watch to be with him. And she's seen the film probably 500 or 600 times. I kid you not. Yeah. She watched it last night. She watched it a few nights before that. And she watched it pretty much every day for the first year after he died. And the other day she was really sad about him being gone, and my brother had to put his dog down. And she said on the family text chain, which is a 24/7 text chain at this point, like we're always on the family text chain. And she said, well, Rach, I guess everything dies, right? Looking for some rabbinical advice. And Rachel said, yes, Mom, everything dies, but it also changes form. and look what daddy's turned into. And it does feel that way in a weird way. It's like I've never understood the power of film until now. It's sort of like this ball of light that's like dad in film form, that I'm carrying around. And it's sort of a balm for people, And when my mom goes to these screenings, it just helps her heal because dad suddenly lives in your heart and in other people's hearts, and they're helped by it. Oddly, I spoke to a grief therapist, a trauma therapist about this, and I asked her, why are people helped by this film so much? Like, even when they've had a bad death in their family, it's somehow, they say that it helps them. And she said, well, it's a form of therapy called imagination therapy, where, we go through a traumatic event and then we go through it and we imagine it differently. We imagine the event differently. And so people are watching your family and they're getting to know your family, but they're also watching their own family and playing out their own experience and seeing it maybe go differently. I think that is just miraculous.
Absolutely. Well, and that was true for me, as you know, when I emailed you about it. Well, what an extraordinary film! It's certainly the most moving film I've seen this year, documentary or otherwise. And I wish you all the luck with the award stuff. But you know what? Maybe that happens. Maybe it doesn't. You've got something way more powerful and valuable to you and to us than whatever comes your way on the awards front. But I certainly wish you the best.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate you taking the time
Yeah, it's
to
been great to
have
talk.
this
Great.
conversation. And I want to say one last thing that I think is really important. Is the other motivating factor was along the lines of what you just said about awards. The film's also just really to me about how to live, and that the outside things, awards, money, all those things, status, they seem to make the world go round in a lot of ways. And there's all these lists, and people like to say their top things and rank us and all this stuff. And at the end of the day, like, the message of the movie is really that love, is the most important measure of your success in life. How did you treat everyone around you? Did you respect everyone if you don't know them and love the ones you do, like dad says? Like, he was able to dispense that advice, but he himself was having such a hard time. And his arc is the biggest one in the film, and the one that I think really motivated me more than anything to share it, was because, like, it is, sure, we all lose our loved ones, and it's a very important universal um, subject that we don't really delve into very often. But what about just how we think of ourselves, and whether or not, how hard we are on ourselves, and how much we need to, like, let go. And just, I think seeing dad go through that, I hope, frees people to shed some of their shame instead of waiting till the last day, before they die.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I would keep that in mind with all this award stuff. I'm like,
Absolutely.
I'm on dad's arc.
That's right. There you
Yeah.
go. There you
Yeah.
go.
Thank you
Well,
so much, Steve.
yes, thank you.